So you want to tighten up your handgun reloads? Give Titegroup a try. Guy Miner here from UltimateReloader.com. Today we'll be talking about a pistol powder or handgun reloads, and we're going kind of old school here. Imagine that from me. We've got ourselves a 1911 45, we've got a 45 single action Ruger Blackhawk, and we've got a 44 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolver. This is building on an earlier video that we did with 38 plus P and 357 Magnums that we shot out of our Henry revolvers. So this is kind of like, boy, that Titegroup powder was interesting. Let's try it in some other cartridges. And that's where we went with it. So we were talking about Hodgdon's Titegroup powder. We're going to get into the burn rate. We're going to take a look at the ideal cartridges for this powder, which is an interesting and useful powder. I've found out a lot more about it in the past few weeks. We're going to put it under the microscope, get a real detailed look at it, and look at how it compares with some other powders. Yes, we have Varget on the bench. That's not a pistol powder. That's because a lot of you rifle shooters know Varget well, and you'll be able to compare that powder with the others that we've got on display when we get to that part. We're going to talk about our results over the chronograph and some shooting impressions that I came up with shooting some of my favorite handguns with a powder I had not used in them before. Finally, we're going to come to some conclusions and some of the real good attributes. I got to admit, a little spoiler alert here, I like the stuff. So let's get into it. Hodgdon's Titegroup is a fast-burning pistol powder. One of its advantages that it's known for is that it is less position sensitive than some other pistol powders. And this is real handy in some of the action shooting sports if you've got your handgun tilted at different ways, because we're talking some pretty large capacity cartridges here. Even the 38 Special, old-fashioned cartridge, lots of room in it, and you get to things like the 45 Colt, oh my goodness, it's a huge cartridge. And that powder can change positions dramatically on where it is inside the cartridge. So that can affect your accuracy and your velocity. Less so with Titegroup, is what Hodgdon's telling us. You can use very small charge weights, and that's interesting. And by playing around with it, I've used anywhere from about 2.5 grains up to about 10 grains in different cartridges. And it's they've all worked out pretty well, but no great big heavy charges. And it's interesting, you talk about a 10 grain load, there's 7,000 grains of powder in 1 pound. 7,000 grains, 10 grains, there's 700 cartridges. If you're using 5 grains, there's 1,400 cartridges, all from 1 pound of powder. I like that. It is ideal for many different handgun cartridges. And I have to tell you, I liked it in the 38 plus P, and I liked it in the 357 Magnum. I loved it in the 44 Mag, the 45 ACP, and the 45 Colt. It worked out really well there. Looking at the burn rate, you can see by the diagram here that it is right up in there, similar to things like old familiar stuff that you may know well. Bullseye and Unique, they're all in that same thing. Unique on the slow side, the Bullseye on the real fast side. It's right in there with those and comparable purposes as a fast burning powder. You can see the ideal burn rate there is somewhere, it's in that range, the Titegroup range, and that is in between about a Liant A3 and the Ramshot True Blue. That's where it belongs, and that makes it really useful in handgun cartridges. Ideal cartridges for this? Well, I'm going to say that the cartridges that we used in our tests, the 38 plus P, not bad in regular 38 Special either, just normal standard loads. I've done some work with that. We haven't published that yet. We will. 357 Magnum, it worked out very well. 44 Magnum, and I didn't try it in a 44 Special load, but it looks like it would be very good for that too. 45 ACP, good old 45 ACP. Short stubby case, but a lot of volume there, and the Titegroup performed well in that, and 45 Colt, it performed well in that too. Very well in that, as a matter of fact. We'll get into that here in a bit. So earlier, we shot 38 plus P and 357 Magnum out of our Henry revolvers. We've made a video on that. If you haven't seen it, you should really take a look at it. It's mostly about the new Barry's bullet, 125 grain, 38 caliber or 357, with the thick plate on it. So this is thicker plate and it's rated for a higher velocity, and that's an interesting bullet. We really liked it. I was impressed with it. One of the things that I noticed right off the bat was reduced recoil. Those revolvers, of course, those Henrys are, they're full-size revolvers. They are not lightweight little tiny guns. And the recoil from that 125 grain bullet was considerably less than a normal 38 load or 38 plus P load with a 158 grain bullet. That lighter bullet did us really, really well. As you can see on our chart here, we use that with 5 grains of Titegroup, which is a max load according to Hodgdon for the 38 plus P, and we got 951 feet per second as our average. So our SD and extreme spreads were a little higher than I like to see, and I want to do some further testing on that in the future. If we find out something, we'll let you know. So one of my favorite cartridges is a 357 Magnum. I've been loading for that since the 1970s, and we used that in our Henry 4-inch revolver as well. Got a considerable bump in velocity. With a 4-inch barrel there, we're at just short of 1,200 feet per second. We're at 1,187 feet per second. And again, because we're using a 125 grain bullet, that is much less recoil than I get when I'm shooting like 158s or 170s out of a 357 Magnum. Very, very nice shooting. Pretty clean burning too. Again, I still had a little too much ES and SD to keep me happy. That'll be something we're looking at in the future along with the 38 plus P load, see if I can tighten that up a bit. So what I wanted to do for this video was to try the Titegroup in some different larger cartridges. Hodgdon talks about it being well suited for the bigger cartridges. They even mention the 45 Colt by name. Well, I happen to really like the 45 Colt. I really like the 44 Magnum, and I really like the 45 ACP. So I brought 3 of my favorite guns to the range, and we got chronograph data on them. I loaded up some different loads, and we're going to take a look at all those. Now for 44 Magnum, it's a handful, okay? If you've got a reasonable weight gun for packing around, that 44 will get your attention. And I know some of you all are out there with those 329s and things that are very, very light. Gavin has one, and they can be brutal to shoot. I happen to really like shooting my 5-inch 629. It is one of my favorite revolvers to shoot. But yeah, the 44 can be too much of a good thing sometimes. So what I wanted to do was load it at 2 different levels. I took a look at the available powder charges in the Hodgdon manual, found out that 10 grains is the most that they recommend for a 240 grain bullet. And I said, okay, 10 grains of Titegroup. And I said, you know what, why don't I back that off a little bit? So I loaded some at 6 and some at 9 grains. Interesting on shooting those, I was not surprised to see that the spent cases from the 6 grain loads were a little bit sooty, because 6 grains does not generate much power, and it's not doing much pressure, and it's not sealing up in the cylinder very well. This is, however, a very shiny, nice looking case. I shot it yesterday. That was from the 9 grain load, and I have not done anything except pick it up and bring it in here to show in the video. It's amazingly clean. That 9 grains developed enough pressure to seal everything, and it shot well. By the way, we used the Berry's 240 grain hollow point plated bullet for this, which is rated for very high velocity, and it was also impressive. It was the first time I'd worked with those particular bullets, and I'm very, very impressed with how clean the revolver was after shooting with the Titegroup and the Berry's bullets. With our 6 grain load, we wound up with a little under 800 feet per second, 791 foot per second average, and that was very mild shooting. You may be able to see that in the video. And I hadn't shot my 44 in a while, so it caught me a little off guard. It always does the first time I shoot it in a while. But that's a good sturdy load that is very similar to the power level of a 45 ACP as well. Just short of 800 feet per second with a 240 grain bullet. Then stepped up to the 9 grain one. I like that load. That had some really nice kick to it. It felt like a 44, and what we did is we pushed it up to close to 1100 feet per second with that 9 grains of Titegroup. That wound up at 1067, And that's enough load for most situations. I wouldn't feel bad about carrying that for most things. Of course, you can take the 44 up a lot higher than that if you want to. And the penalty for that, of course, is recoil. So if you want something that's a little more controllable, load it down a little bit with this Titegroup. Our ES and SD figures for both the 6 and the 9 grain loads were much, much better than what I'd seen with the 38 and 357 in our earlier video. So I thought, well, we're on to something good here with these bigger bore cartridges. And I think that Titegroup is a very good alternative. A lot of you probably, like me, have been loving the 44 since the 80s, and I've always had a more mild load for it, usually out of Unique or something along those lines. And I think Titegroup is a very good, very clean burning alternative to that for a similar power level. Load this up to around 900 or 1,000 feet per second with a 240, 250 grain bullet maybe, and you're going to be looking pretty good. Very comfortable to shoot and still plenty of punch for most things. So one of my favorites is the 45 ACP. It's been around even longer than I have, okay? That's a good thing. It's well proven, it's been used in the military, in law enforcement, in the sporting fields, and for self-defense. It's also a very popular target cartridge. So you get your good old 1911 45 ACP, or there's a lot of other designs in 45 ACP as well now, and you've got yourself a pretty serious cartridge. Yeah, it's old school, okay, and I know you can have that 9mm versus 45 argument all you want. I'm going to stay away from that today. We shot the Titegroup in the 45 ACP, and I have to tell you, I was impressed. Now, used a Barry's bullet on this. 230 grain hollow point Barry's bullet, and that has a very deep hollow point and some skives cut into it. Little twisted cuts in there that help it open up faster. Barry's recommends it as both a self-defense type of bullet and as a target bullet. I like it. I did notice that it seems to carry its diameter pretty far forward in the design, and when I loaded the overall cartridge length a little shorter than normal, I was able to start getting some better reliability out of it, because before that I was having a little bit of trouble feeding from the magazines, and I was having a little bit of trouble extracting a loaded round from the chamber once I shortened my overall length up a bit. So that's something you're going to want to, things improved a lot once I shortened up my length a little bit. That's something you're going to want to adjust for your particular magazines and your particular 45. Find that spot where that bullet needs to be seated to so that it functions really well in your gun. Again, it was a very satisfying shooting experience. I love the 45. I put thousands and thousands of rounds through this, over 80,000 rounds through it. It's a good old gun. Bought it in '97, first year for the Yonkers Kimber 45s coming out, and it's still doing really, really well. The 230 grain bullet is a very standard weight for the 45 ACP, so I want to stick with that. Hodgdon says 4.8 grains is what you should use. I said, Roger that, I'll do that. And away we went. 809 feet per second average, 809.9, okay. And we got a nice tight extreme spread of only 25.6, and our SD really made me sit up and take notice. 8.5 foot per second spread there on our SD, and that's a nice tight figure. So when I can get that and clean burning and good velocity, I like the load. I like the load a lot. The powder worked very well for the 45 ACP. 45 Colt is one of my long-term favorites. I've got two old revolvers. I've got a really old Smith & Wesson double-action revolver, and I've got a really old Colt New Service double-action revolver at home. And I don't shoot those very often, but when I do, I tend to use about a 250 or 255 grain lead bullet at modest velocity, no more than about 800 feet per second. I'm trying to take it easy on those old guns. They've lasted a long time, and I don't need to shorten that up any. I also have at my disposal a 45 Colt Ruger Blackhawk. Very, very strong revolver. That one I can load up to the point, the Ruger's fine with the load, I can load up to the point where, ow, it hurts to shoot. This isn't that kind of load. This is the kind of load where you can take your 45 maybe an old Colt, maybe the Ruger. You can take that out to the range and be comfortable shooting it, shoot nice scores, bring some steel, do whatever it is you're going to do with that thing, have some fun with it without beating yourself up and without beating up your gun too much. Now, the powder charge on this, be careful on that. 45 Colt, 1873 is when it came out as a black powder cartridge. It's been through a lot of changes, and there have been some heavier loads, there have been some lighter loads, there have been some longer cases, some shorter cases. It's got a long history that we can't get into right now, but if you've got a Ruger, you can safely load that up more. Most loading manuals will have both a 45 Colt section and a section for the 45 Colt in the Ruger Blackhawks or the Thompson Center Contender, two very strong pistols. So you can fudge a little bit on that. Don't go over what the manual says. If you have an older 45 Colt single action, you don't want to beat it up too much. If you've got an older Smith & Wesson and 45 Colt, you don't want to beat it up too much. Stay within the recommendations. This time around, I used the 255 grain Hornady. It's a very soft lead bullet, has an interesting way of being lubed on there. Unlike a cast bullet that has grooves, this has got sort of a coating on it, and it works out really well. I used a charge of 6.2 grains, which is higher than you would want in one of those old Colt revolvers. Not by much, but it's higher. And it's also well under the max listed for something strong like the Ruger Blackhawk. We wound up with an average of 810 feet per second. It felt very mellow. I mean, the Blackhawk's a fairly heavy gun, and it's got a nice grip shape. It handles recoil well, and it was very comfortable to shoot, pretty clean burning. I like that. 810 feet per second, extreme spread of 22 feet per second, which is not bad at all. And I was astounded to see 7.2 feet per second for the SD. That is tight. And we're talking here a big old 1873 vintage cartridge and a Ruger Blackhawk. And I'm looking at that SD figure of under 10 and my eyes opened up a little bit. The other thing that I noticed is that the 44 mag, the 45 ACP, and the 45 Colt all had very similar muzzle velocities. In fact, their average between the 45 ACP and the 45 Colt was less than 1 foot per second difference. They were very, very tight. 810 versus 809. Good grief. That is really tight. So yeah, I had fun with this. I got to shoot some of my favorite revolvers, and the results were quite good. Now, let's take a look at the powder. So we want to take a closer look at the powders. The powders being Titegroup, CFE-Pistol, and then the Trail Boss, and down there on the end, those big chunks, that's Varget, that's a rifle powder. We wanted to take a look at them. Sometimes we do that with our microscope. This time we used our macro lens and got a good photo of it all, showing the differences. Now the Titegroup and the CFE-Pistol look very similar, and that points out one of the reasons why you want to make sure you change out your powder after you're done. Empty that dispenser for safety's sake, get it back in the original container, or label your dispenser, something so that you know exactly what's in there. If you take a break from your loading project, sometimes I don't load anything for a week or two, and I'll come back to it, and if I've left my powder in there, it's kind of a guessing game, kind of a detective game to try and figure out, well, what was the last powder I had in there? You don't want to be playing that game. You want it back in the original container or well labeled. So the others, the Trail Boss, is pretty doggone interesting looking. Little donuts, I kind of like that, looks cool. And of course the Varget are the bigger chunks. Now, this all gets real interesting when you start figuring out how well it meters. I set my powder measure, manual powder measure, and I just started throwing the charges. You saw how tight those SD numbers were. That was just, I'd set it and I would throw all 50 charges. Take a look at them, they all look about the same, and loaded the bullets, seated the bullets into them, loaded the ammo, and shot them. And that was just fine. It worked out really, really well. I can tell that the Trail Boss and the CFE-Pistol, and the Titegroup are all going to work pretty good if you used them in a progressive machine too, because that doesn't measure out it doesn't weigh every single powder charge either. So at the end of all our loading and shooting in these big bore revolvers and the 45 ACP, I came to a few conclusions about Titegroup. It is a fast burning pistol powder. I was amazed at the tight SD figures that we got out of it in all three of these different cartridges. It did really well, particularly in the 45s, but the 44 wasn't bad either. Real nice tight ES and SD figures that should lead to better accuracy downrange. It seems to be quite clean burning, especially if the pressure is kept up there towards the maximum level loads where it'll actually seal the brass against the cylinder walls. That's a good thing. You can use very small charge weights, which makes it pretty economical to use. I don't know about you, but I have a limited shooting budget. And when I put good money down for pound of powder, if I can get hundreds of rounds of practice ammo out of that, I like that. That's a good thing. Clean burning, I didn't have to do much cleaning on these. They came out, I was surprised, especially with the 44 Magnum, how nice and clean it looked after I was done shooting. And I'm going to put Titegroup down as one of my favorite powders for loading big bore cartridges for handguns. 44s and 45s. It just made a real good impression on me, and I'll be using it on my loading bench quite a bit in the future. What I want to know is, are you using Titegroup? If you are, what are you using it in? How are the results working out for you? Is it being good on targets? Are you getting good results out of it, or is it giving you any kind of difficulties? I sure didn't have any difficulties with it in all the shooting I've done, which was actually quite a bit and a lot of fun. So, if so, drop a comment and let's have a discussion. That means it's time to wrap it up.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, we're on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, where we've got unrestricted content, and Instagram. Make sure to follow us on all those channels. Ultimate Reloader also has a commercial solutions division serving law enforcement, the military, and the gun industry. We have some unique capabilities, including a comprehensive suite of recoil testing and evaluation capabilities, trigger profiling, and more. If you're interested in custom rifles like what we build here on the channel or gunsmithing services, you're going to want to go to rifles.ultimatereloader.com and get on the wait list. If you want to learn lucrative gunsmithing like what I show here on the channel, including building custom rifles and Cerakote plus a whole bunch more, you're going to want to check out the Colorado School of Trades, schooloftrades.edu. Thanks again for watching.